Hello, this is the second video in my series for remodeling my pantry. In this video, I'm going to give an overview on how I installed the base cabinets, getting us ready to installing the countertops in the next video. I start by removing the baseboards from the pantry. I'm only going to be removing the baseboards where I want to install the base cabinet. That way I'll still have that nice detail and trim around the other areas, making the pantry look cohesive. I use an oscillating saw to cut these out, and I use the saw attachment that's for wood with nails because these baseboards have been nailed into the wall. The cabinets that I'm installing are 12 inches deep, but I'm going to put these cabinets on top of a kick plate that's 10 inches deep. So I'm removing the baseboard off the entirety of the back wall because that will be fully covered by the cabinets. And then on the two side walls, I'm only removing the baseboard from 10 inches from the back wall because that's as deep as the kick plate is going to come out. I'm actually using wall cabinets here instead of base cabinets due to the size of the pantry. Base cabinets typically come 24 inches out from the wall, and this pantry is about 68 inches by 37 inches. So if I were to use base cabinets that come out 24 inches, the door wouldn't actually open all the way, and I would hit the other wall of the pantry before the door could fully swing open. In this case, I'm using wall cabinets, which are 12 inches deep, so that way the door can open fully and I'll still have some space behind it before hitting the other wall of the pantry. I'm using the Diamond Now Arcadia wall cabinets that I purchased from Lowe's. These are already painted white, skipping me a step from having to paint them myself. You can see a couple times in this video that I get a little bit of that white smoke coming out the tip of the oscillating saw blade. This happened whenever I was hitting a nail, and even though I was using the wood and nails saw blade, I still had some issues cutting through the nails. So if I was right on a nail, I tried to move the saw blade a bit to the left or to the right and cut through where there wasn't a nail so that I was focused just on the wood. After I'd made a cut in the baseboard all the way through, then I alternated between using a chisel and a mini crowbar just to pull the wood off the wall. It was actually pretty difficult to pull the baseboards out even after I'd cut them with the oscillating saw because the tile in the pantry had actually been laid on top of other tile. So I had to get this grout deconnected from the baseboard and then actually wiggle the baseboard up from underneath because there was a fair bit of baseboard down below where I was able to reach with the oscillating saw. I also still had to contend with the nails that were holding the baseboard into the drywall. Those nails prevented me from just pulling the baseboard fully up and removing it from the tile that way. So I went through nail by nail and cut those short with heavy-duty wire cutters and then knocked whatever was left of the nail back into the wall so that the baseboard wouldn't catch on it when I tried to lift it straight up. With the baseboards removed, I wrote down all the dimensions of the pantry in this notebook, and then I wrote down all the different cuts of wood that I need to make sure that I build my kick plate to the right size. I kept this notebook close by as I was doing all my measurements and cutting, making sure that I had the correct dimensions for all the different pieces I needed to assemble. The first piece of the kick plate that I assemble is the long piece that's going to go on the back wall. So the long dimension was 67.5 inches, and I know that I want this kick plate to be 10 inches deep. I also know that I'm going to have to put a face on the front of the kick plate to make it look nice and have that same white color as the cabinets. This face is going to be half an inch deep. These long boards are going to be my outer dimension, so I measured them to 67.5 inches, but I have to assemble this into a rectangle somehow. So I'm considering the thickness of these boards, which is 1.5 inches, and I'm taking 1.5 inches off the first board and 1.5 inches off the second board to leave that cross dimension at 6.5 inches so that my overall dimension of the final assembled kick plate will be 10 inches. My husband was helping me this time to cut these two boards, so he caught the long end while I secured the other end in place and cut right on that 67.5 inch line. Whenever I was cutting the long boards without an extra helping hand, I set up supports on the other table so that I could have this board be level and all the way out without needing somebody to help hold it. With the two long boards cut, I set up the miter saw to cut the two short boards. These are both at 6.5 inches. I use a measuring tape and a speed square to lay out these dimensions on the 2x4s. I don't account for the thickness of the miter saw in these dimensions, so whenever I'm lining up the cut on the miter saw, I always line the saw blade up to be on the opposite side of the wood that I want to keep. This way, the final dimension of the wood that I just measured remains that measurement, and the thickness of the saw blade comes out of the excess piece of wood. I use a right angle clamp to line up these two pieces of wood to form the first L of my rectangle. The 67.5-inch board is going to be the long board, so I push that one farther out and line up the other edge of the 6.5 board to be touching the front face of that. Then I use a drill bit to countersink two holes, that way whenever I put the screw in, my wood doesn't split. Then I put two screws in to hold these boards together. I make sure that the screws that I'm using are long enough to go through both boards. The 2x4s are 1.5 inches thick, so I need the screw to be over 1.5 inches so that it bites into the second board deep enough to hold it in place. With the first two boards assembled, I take them out of the right angle clamp and then put the second two boards in. This will give me two L's that I'll then attach together to form the rectangle. You can see that this short board isn't perfectly level here and has a lip sticking up above the other board. Before I put this into the pantry, I'm going to sand any of those edges down so that the final kick plate is fully level. Now I bring the two L shapes together and then I measure just to make sure I'm at that 10 inches on both sides. Then I clamp the boards together on each end, making sure that I have room from the side of the clamp that I'll be able to use the countersink drill bit to pre-drill the hole and then screw two screws in. I take the clamps off and then flip the rectangle over so I can get that final fourth side screwed together. At this point it's pretty stable, so I just use my hands to hold it together while I countersink the holes and then screw in the screws. I put this piece of the kick plate into the pantry just to make sure it fit, and then I moved all the cabinets into the pantry so that I can determine where the other cross braces are going to go on this kick plate. I want more support on the bottom of the cabinets than just the long edges of the kick plate. So where the two cabinets connect, I'm drawing a line to mark where I'm going to install another cross brace. I've cut two more 6.5-inch pieces that I'm going to assemble right underneath where these cabinets would connect. This way all four edges of the cabinet are going to have some type of structure underneath. I'm using a rag to lift up this cross piece just a little bit before I assemble it. This is because the kick plate itself isn't level yet, just due to some of the natural warping in the 2x4 boards. Using the rag to hold the cross brace up a little bit made it more level with the kick plate than when I didn't have the rag underneath it. And then after I have all of these fully attached, I'll go through and sand any of those lips that stand too high and prevent the kick plate from being level. I assemble these supports the same way I did the end pieces, using a countersink bit to drill through the edge of the kick plate and the front end of this cross piece, and then screwing it together with two screws on each side. With the kick plate fully assembled, I go in with an orbital sander using 40 grit sandpaper just to knock down any of those high edges, and I check that this is level and sand off any places that make this not level. I do this on both the top and bottom of the kick plate. At this point, I'm just checking that the wood is level all the way across the kick plate, and not that it's actually level to the floor. I level the kick plate to the floor later on in the video. With the long edge of the kick plate done, I start working on the shorter edge of the kick plate. This is the piece that's going to go on the wall that's 37.5 inches long. I measure out my long boards. In this case, it's 37.5 inches minus the 10 inches of the other kick plate that this will rest up against. So the total length of my long boards are going to be 27.5 inches, and I'm using the same length for the cross brace, which is 6.5 inches. I've sped this up quite a bit because I'm using the exact same process that I followed for the longer kick plate. So I cut everything on the miter saw, lined everything up using the right angle clamp, and then I'm using the countersink bit and then screwing these pieces together with two screws in each side. I also marked where the center crossbeam is going to go based on where the two cabinets on this wall connect. Then I finish this off, sanding again with the 40 grit sandpaper just to knock down any of those high spots and make this kick plate level. I take the finished kick plate into the pantry and check the fit. In this case, it's a little bit tight on one of the edges, so I take this back to the miter saw just to square up one edge and take off a little bit of material until it fits. It's really close to fitting, so I'm only going to take just a little bit of material off the end. I move this piece of the kick plate around until I line up the blade to be just under the edge, so that way I'll take off the width of the blade, which is 1/8 of an inch, plus just a little bit extra. Once I have this lined up, I clamp the kick plate down to make sure it's not going to move while I make this cut. I pull the miter saw all the way forward so I can start at the far edge of the kick plate, and then I lower it down halfway into the material while it's cutting. Then I come back and make another pass, making sure that this material comes off cleanly. There's nails in the drywall behind the baseboard that I'm expecting to be representative of where studs are. So I started out trying to find my studs by putting a T-square up against the center of the nail and then drawing a line straight up so that I can see where that stud is in the wall. I did this on both the long wall and the short wall where the cabinets will be, so that I have all the studs so I can screw cabinets into the walls. So I double checked where the studs were after finding the nails from the drywall into the stud. I double checked with a stud finder, and it turned out the stud finder was reading studs about an inch or two to the right of where this bottom nail was. So just to check where my studs were, I drilled into the wall and made sure that I see a stud there. And it's actually correct that this is not an indication of a stud. This is just empty wall behind here. So here's where my stud is. Here's another example. The screw at the bottom followed this line. Here's where I found the stud with the stud finder 2 different times. So I drilled in there and there's a stud here instead of here. And the last stud that I'm going to screw into is here instead of here. So now that I definitively know where all my studs are, I prepare the boards that I'm going to screw into the studs, and these are the boards that I'm going to connect the cabinets to. Getting the cabinet measurements can be difficult, so I'm using this board to make sure that I get a really sturdy support for the cabinet, even in the event that I miss the stud just a little bit. Using these boards is also beneficial because I know that there's some bow in the wall where the drywall isn't exactly straight anymore. These boards are going to allow me to line all the cabinets up and make sure that the front is seamless, even if there's a little bit of discrepancy at the back. And then I'm creating a gap intentionally, knowing that I'll be able to cover this gap at the end, which will be not only the gap between the cabinets, but also the gap between any bowing of the drywall. I'm using 1x3 boards for this, which are 3/4 of an inch thick and 2.5 inches wide. I'm cutting each of these to 30 inches in length, which is the same height as my cabinets. These boards will go on top of the kick plate and behind the cabinet, which will allow me to secure the entire length of the cabinet to the wall. I take a small piece of 1x3 and center it up on the stud, and then I draw guidelines on each side of this 1x3 so that I can use the final block that I've cut to 30 inches and put it in place based on these guidelines. Then I'm going to put 3 screws into that block and screw it into the stud. I've measured each of these boards so that I know where to put the screws. So I have 4 inches, 9 inches, 14 inches, 19 inches, and 24 inches all marked on each of the boards. I line the board up and match it to the guidelines against the wall, and then I'm going to screw the screws in at 4 inches, 14 inches, and 24 inches. The 9 and 19 inch measurements I'm going to transfer to the back of the cabinet, and that's how I'm going to connect the cabinet to this board and into the stud. I countersink these holes to make sure that the wood doesn't split, and then right before I screw in the first screw, I check for level to make sure that this is in line. I specifically use a countersink drill bit to make sure that this screw can go all the way into the wood and sit flush, rather than sitting out above the wood and causing any issues with my cabinets sitting up tight against the wood. Before putting the cabinets on top of the kick plates, I want to make sure that the kick plates are level to the floor. Most of the spots here were pretty level, but this one side of the floor wasn't exactly level. It dipped a little bit lower, so I used a few shims to lift up the kick plate until it was level. These shims will stay in place to make sure my kick plate stays level, make sure my cabinets stay level, and that the resulting countertop will also be level. I will later break off the shims to make sure that they don't stick out beyond the face of the kick plate. So we're going to install a cabinet here that's 12 inches by 12 inches, and there's no stud on either side of the wall that I can screw that cabinet into. So what I'm going to do is take this piece of wood. It's a 3/4 of an inch thick, the same as these backers. It's 9 inches long, so I'm going to put a screw through here and a screw through here to screw it into the base. And then I've got a 7-inch piece of this backer. I'm going to center it over this, and before I screw this piece in, I'll put a screw connecting these together, leaving this space open to be able to put 2 screws through the back of the cabinet and have it mounted. That way I'll mount it to the back, and then I can even put some screws into the base itself so that it won't wobble. I clamp these two pieces of wood together and then draw a line right up the center so that I can put a screw in the center to hold these pieces together. Then I pre-drill a hole using the same countersink bit and assemble these together using a screw that's long enough to go through the first one and into the second one. I pre-drill a hole in the bottom of the top piece of wood and then slot this in next to the backer. Then I screw this in place with a screw in each of those two holes that I just drilled. After the block is screwed in place, I make marks on it where I want to put the screws through the cabinet and into this piece of wood. Then I'll take those measurements down and transfer those onto the back of the cabinet to make sure I get the holes in the right place. Before I install any of the cabinets into the pantry, I check all of the joints and edges to make sure that there's no overhanging glue. This glue could cause the cabinet not to set level on the kick plate. I cut any of this glue off with a sharp knife. So I've already put in the corner cabinet and this cabinet to the right. They're really hard spots to film, so I did not put those on video. But I'm going to show you how I install the cabinet using these backers. So I'm going to put the 30-inch cabinet right up next to this cabinet and mark where it goes to on the left. So I've got the two edges, and then I'm going to take measurements from the edge of my cabinet, which is actually going to be based off of this lip right here, to where the start of this board is, and then I'll make a measurement to this edge of the board, and then the same thing here to here from the end of the cabinet that'll sit about here. And I'm going to transfer those measurements onto the back of the cabinet so I can see from the back exactly where I want to put my holes so that I can hit these spots that I've pre-marked for the screws where I want the cabinet to screw into the wall. Well, I've got the cabinet in position, and before I actually screw it into the wall, I'm going to check for level. And this is rocking more than I would like it to rock. So I'm going to take some shims and shim it underneath the bottom of the cabinet so that it stays in place. So I'm perfectly level now. I had to put a shim on each side. So I'm going to leave the shims for now until I finish screwing the cabinet into the wall. And then I'll come back, take the shims out, cut them so that they fit right up against the edge of the 2x4, because I still have to put a faceplate on here and I don't want the shim in the way. So I'll mark that, pull it out after it's screwed in, cut them, and then put the shims back in where they go. They're directly underneath the edge that's sitting on top of the 2x4 frame. So part of transferring the measurements, I'm going to take my pencil and draw right along the outer edge so I can measure from where this outer edge of the cabinet is in relation to the backer that we've screwed into the wall. And then I'm going to take the cabinet off. Again, I'm marking where my shims are before I take the cabinet off and before I take them out. After I've marked where to cut the shims, I also label them left and right so that I know which side of the cabinet they go back under. Next, I measure from the outer edge of where the cabinet will sit to the left side of the backer board and then to the right side of the backer board. I write these measurements down on the board so that I don't forget them. I do the same for the backer on the far right side of where the cabinet will sit. This time I use the left side of the left backer board just to hold the measuring tape in place, but I make sure to add on that additional distance to where the edge of the cabinet will sit. That's why this shows a little bit more writing than the other one. But I'll add these together and transfer that measurement onto the back of the cabinet next. So the first thing I do when transferring the measurements is label my cabinet. So the right side of my cabinet will be using the measurements from the left side of the wall. So I mark left on the right side and right on the left side just to make sure I don't get the measurements backwards and miss all of the studs. Then I measure the same dimensions that I wrote on the backer boards on the wall. I'm marking both the left side and the right side of the backer board. I mark this at the top and the bottom of the cabinet. Then I use a long T-square to line up those two marks and draw a straight line all the way down the cabinet. This will be two lines, one for the right side and left side of the backer board. If I forget the dimensions, I just reference back to what I've written down on the backer board on the wall. After I have the two lines drawn with the T-square, I measure to find the center. This was a 2.5-inch thick piece of wood, so I'm measuring 1.25 inches and then drawing a line straight down this. This is going to represent the center of the backer board, which if I drill through, I'll be able to hit the stud behind it. Now I measure 9 inches and 19 inches from the bottom of the cabinet and make 2 marks there where it intersects with the center line. This will represent where I'm going to put the 2 screws through the cabinet into the backer board and into the stud. Next, I take my drill and I drill a hole right on those 2 marks. From the front of the cabinet, I'll be able to see where that hole is and I'll know right where to put the screw. Then I repeat this on the other side of the cabinet, measuring the dimensions from the outer edge of the cabinet to record where the edges of the backer board are. Then I draw my center line and measure up 9 and 19 inches from the bottom of the cabinet to mark spots for a hole. I pre-drill those holes so that from the front of the cabinet I'll know where to put the screws in. I put the cabinet back onto the kick plate and I cut the shims. Then I install the shims underneath the cabinet before I screw this into the wall. This will ensure that the screws hold the cabinet level. Now with the cabinet lined up against the wall, I go through the holes that we pre-drilled and drill all the way through the cabinet and into the backer board behind it. Even though the holes are in the cabinet, they're not in the backer board wood yet, and I don't want that wood to split, especially because I won't be able to see if it does anymore. With all the holes pre-drilled, I'm now ready to use the cabinet screws. These cabinet screws are long enough to go through the back of the cabinet, through the backer board, and into the stud behind it. Again, it's important to make sure that the screws are the right length to go through all the materials so that everything has the appropriate grab. I'm going to do the same thing for the last cabinet by transferring these measurements onto the back of the cabinet. This overhang is 1/4 inch, so if I measure from this edge to here and add 1/4 inch, it'll give me the total distance. And then since this doesn't go into a stud when I actually screw it in place, I'm going to be using these, which are shorter and won't break through the drywall on the other side of the wood. And then I'm probably going to take one of the longer cabinet screws once the cabinet is installed and screw through the bottom into the frame. So I did everything described there, but because of the odd angle of where this cabinet was, I didn't get any good footage to show. So now with all 4 cabinets installed, I'm moving on to the finishing details to make this look nice and cohesive. I'm going to put another piece of the kick plate underneath the corner cabinet. I measure the length between the 2 kick plates so that I can have a board that'll sit about 2 inches back from the front edge of the cabinet. I mark this length on a new piece of 2x4 and cut to this length. I also cut a 45-degree angle into each of the edges of the kick plate so that way it can set nicely up against the kick plates that are already installed in the pantry. I slide this piece of wood into place against the other 2 kick plates and check to make sure that those angles fit. You can see here that it slots really nicely. Then I drill 2 holes on each side of that kick plate so that I can screw this into the other pieces. Next, I'm going to cut 2 pieces of 1x2 to cover the gap between the cabinet and the wall. Each of these pieces would be 30 inches long. But as I was setting this up, I realized that because of how the wall bows, I actually need 4 15-inch pieces so that I can specifically make each of these pieces follow the bow in the wall. The longest edge of these pieces of wood is 1.5 inches. The gap between the cabinet and the wall ranged between 1 1/8 inches and 1.25 inches based on where I was on the cabinet. So the bottom of the cabinet was closer to the wall than the top of the cabinet just because of how that wall has bowed over time. So I used 2 15-inch pieces on both of the gaps, and I was able to customize the width of this piece based on if it was going at the bottom or the top of the gap. I used the table saw to remove just the width of the saw blade from each of these pieces, and then whether it was going at the bottom or the top, I continued to move just a little bit more material with each pass until these fit perfectly between the wall and the cabinet. This was one of the cuts that I felt the least safe doing, so I want to talk about table saw safety here. I made sure as I was pushing each of these blocks through that I wasn't standing directly behind it in case there was any kickback. I'm also using push tools on the top and the back so that my hands don't need to get near the saw blade. Anytime that I did need to get near the saw blade, such as to remove the fully cut material, I made sure that the saw was completely off and that the blade had stopped spinning entirely before reaching in to get the material. I continued removing the width of the saw blade from each of these pieces until every single one fit. I kept track of this by labeling them left bottom, left top, right bottom, and right top. Each time after I made a pass on the table saw, I checked if these pieces of wood fit between the wall and the cabinet yet. When they didn't, I went and took another round of material off. This was how I felt the most safe doing this, rather than taking off a larger chunk of material and having a bigger risk of kickback. After each of the pieces fit, I painted them white. I used 2 coats of paint to make sure that there was even coverage. Once the paint has fully dried, I'm ready to install these on the cabinets. I use a piece of 2x4 to let the wood rest on, and then I use a tool, actually the same tool that I used from the table saw, to hold that piece of wood forward so that it doesn't fall backwards as I'm nailing this into place. I use a nail gun to shoot through the cabinet, through the wood, and into the wall behind it. I know that there's no electricity in the wall here, so I'm not worried about hitting any wires. Therefore, it's not a problem if the nail goes a little bit beyond the wood and into the wall. If there was a risk of wires here, I would need to use a different nail gun and different nails, but this is what I had set up, and I knew that there was not a risk of hitting an electrical wire. After I do the bottom piece, I assemble the top piece, and then I move to the other side of the pantry so that I can do the bottom and top on the right side. I used the same caulk that I used to fill in the baseboards before I'd started painting, but the nozzle was too big to fit here, so I moved it into a smaller syringe. So after everything has been nailed to the wall, I just run down that seam between the wood and the wall and fill in that little bit of gap that's left. The last step of installing the base cabinets was to put the finishing touches on the kick plate. So here I have this white piece of 1/2 inch thick MDF, and I'm cutting it to the same length as all the different pieces of the kick plate. So there's the long piece that goes to the left of the corner, the short piece that goes to the right of the corner cabinet, and then the piece that goes underneath the corner cabinet itself. On that piece that goes underneath the corner cabinet, I did cut each side of it at a 45-degree angle, the same way as I did with the 2x4, to make sure that all those pieces of wood are flush up against each other. To install the kick plate, I press it up flush against the 2x4 kick plate behind it, and then I use the brad nail gun to nail this into place. I'm careful to avoid nailing right at the gap between 2 cabinets because I know that I have screws underneath that, and I don't want to send a nail through a screw. After the kick plate is installed, I go over any of the nail holes with wood filler. This wood filler is stainable and paintable, so after it dries, I sand it off with 180 grit sandpaper, and then I paint everything white so that it's a nice matching color that matches the cabinets. I also use this same caulk to fill in the gaps between the 3 different pieces of the white kick plate, and then between the kick plate and the wall itself. Thanks for watching the second video in this series of the Pantry Remodel, focused on installing the base cabinets. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to see the next video in the series, installing the countertops.